bucolic countryside around Proskuriv, with fields of flax and wheat and orchards of cherries and plums. As in many such memorial books, the text is in Yiddish and Hebrew, and includes a foreword by a well-known townsman, in this case the folklorist Avrom Rechtman. There are the usual tales of local personalities and municipal institutions. The book concludes with the names of the martyred, a list that extends to 30 pages. What differentiates Khurban Proskurov, though, is that it was written in 1924, 9 years before Hitler's rise to power and 15 years before the start of the Second World War. It commemorates a different Khurban, a different Holocaust. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say the real beginning of the same Holocaust. The destruction of Proskuriv took place a year after the establishment of a Ukrainian state that promised broad freedoms and national autonomy to its Jewish minority, and 3 months after the armistice of November the 11th, 1918, that ended the Great War. Delegates from 32 nations had just gathered in Paris to work out the treaties that would formally cap what H.G. Wells called the war that will end war. Meanwhile, 1,300 miles to the east, on the afternoon of February the 15th, 1919, Ukrainian soldiers murdered over 1,000 Jewish civilians in what was, at the time, possibly the single deadliest episode of violence to befall the Jewish people in their long history of oppression. The massacre in Proskuriv was not an isolated event. Between November 1918 and March 1921, during the civil war that followed the Great War, over 1,000 anti-Jewish riots and military actions, both of which were commonly referred to as pogroms, were documented in about 500 different locales throughout what is now Ukraine, and which was at the time contested territory between Russian, Polish, Ukrainian and multinational Soviet successor states of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. This was not the first wave of pogroms in the area, but its scope eclipsed previous bouts of violence in terms of the range of participants, the number of victims, and the depths of barbarity. Ukrainian peasants, Polish townsfolk, and Russian soldiers robbed their Jewish neighbours with impunity, stealing property they believed rightfully belonged to them. Armed militants, with the acquiescence and support of large segments of the population, tore out Jewish men's beards, ripped apart Torah scrolls, raped Jewish girls and women, and in many cases tortured Jewish townsfolk before gathering them in market squares, marching them to the outskirts of town, and shooting them. On at least one occasion, insurgent fighters barricaded Jews in a synagogue and burned down the building. The largest of the anti-Jewish massacres left over 1,000 people dead, but the vast majority were much smaller affairs. More than half the incidents resulted only in property damage, injury, and at most a few fatalities. The numbers are contested, but a conservative estimate is that 40,000 Jews were killed during the riots, and another 70,000 subsequently perished from their wounds or from disease, starvation, and exposure as a direct result of the attacks. Some observers counted closer to 300,000 victims. Although that higher figure is likely exaggerated, most historians today would agree that the total number of pogrom-related deaths within the Jewish community between 1918 and 1921 was well over 100,000. The lives of many more were shattered. Approximately 600,000 Jewish refugees were forced to flee across international borders, and millions more were displaced internally. About 2/3 of all Jewish houses and over half of all Jewish businesses in the region were looted or destroyed. The pogroms traumatized the affected communities for at least a generation and set off alarms around the world. I had always